If you've watched more than 5 minutes of this channel, you know that number. It's the mission statement. It's the supposed total of every single North American PlayStation 1 game ever released. I've used it as my North Star, my finish line, and the big hook in my intro since day one. But as I get deeper into the index, I've started to realise that the 1278 count isn't actually a hard fact handed down by Sony. It's more of a collector's legend, a number we've all just sort of agreed on because we've needed a goal. The reality is a lot messier. If you try to find a definitive official list, you end up down a rabbit hole of regional variants, greatest hits revisions, and educational titles that barely qualify as games. Depending on who you ask, the full set could be 1284, 1300, or even more if you count the weird stuff. The number 1278 is a nice, neat target, but the more I research, the more I feel like I'm trying to count sands while the tide is coming in. I'm starting to find ghost games. These are the titles that look like they belong in the index, sound like they belong in the index, and in some cases, I've even started writing scripts for them, only to realise at the last second that they never actually touched American soil. They are the PAL exclusives, the games that lived in the UK and Europe, but were completely invisible to the NTSC-U market. Lately, I've had to throw out entire scripts because of this. I've had to cross names off my master list and rethink what this journey actually is. Today, I want to pull back the curtain on the 1278 lie. I want to talk about the games that almost tricked me into indexing them, and why trying to document every single PS1 game is a bit like chasing a ghost in a machine. Welcome to the 1278 lie, solving the PS1's greatest mystery. While the mission is usually to document all 1278 games released in North America, today we're stepping sideways and trying to discover what that 1278 number actually is. I need to be upfront. That number, 1278, is a challenge I set for myself because I love a goal. It's a hook that tells you exactly what this channel is about, and it gives us a finish line to aim for. But as I've spent more time digging through the archives and capturing footage, I've had to face a reality that every serious collector eventually hits. The PlayStation library is a mess. It's a sprawling, disorganised web of regional exclusives, silent re-releases, and games that exist in a sort of geographical limbo. The truth is, I've already made mistakes. I've had moments where I've played a game, loved it, and even started the indexing process before realising it was a PAL ghost. It's frustrating when you've spent hours with a controller in your hand to find out that the game doesn't technically count as the NTSC-U mission, but instead of just burying those games in a folder and forgetting about them, I wanted to take a moment to look at them. By the time I actually hit that final 1278th entry, I'm certain there will be comments reminding me of a childhood favourite I missed, or pointing out a game I included that never actually saw a US shelf. And honestly, I'm okay with that. We're not reading a wiki here, we're documenting a personal journey through the greatest console ever made. So today, we're looking at the anomalies, the games that almost tricked the index. The best place to start with this confession is the mistakes I've already made. If you look back at the index, you'll find Adidas Power Soccer. I covered it, I documented it, and I moved on to the next one. It was one of my personal childhood games. It was one of the first games I ever had when I bought a PlayStation. And when I started the index, I wanted to pick the first 5 games that I remember fondly as a kid, and that was one of them. It was a bad game, but it was my game, so I indexed it. But as I sat down to prep for this episode, I realised something that made my stomach drop. Adidas Power Soccer International 97 never actually had a North American release. I'd played it, I'd captured the footage, and because it felt such like a global staple, I just assumed it was part of the 1278. It's a perfect example of how easily the lines blur when you're a UK gamer trying to archive a US library. To me, Adidas Power Soccer was just part of the furniture. It was one of those games you saw in every second-hand shop and every mate's collection. It didn't feel like an exclusive. It just felt like a PlayStation game. This is where the 1278 lie starts to bite. When you realise you've already checked a box that technically doesn't exist in your region you're documenting, it makes you question the rest of the list. How many other international editions or sports titles have I grandfathered into the index just because they were sitting on my shelf growing up? It's a frustrating realisation, but it's also an honest one. It shows that even with all the spreadsheets and databases in the world, your own memory can be the biggest hurdle. I've spent my life thinking of certain games as universal PS1 experiences, only to find out they were regional secrets. And while it messes with the official count, it also highlights just how distinct our experience in the UK really was. We weren't just playing a slower version of the US library, we were playing a different library entirely. Survival horror is one of the pillars of the PlayStation. It's a genre I could talk about for hours, and it's a massive part of the index. I'd actually started the prep work for a survival horror episode, pulling together a list of grittier, more obscure titles to give the genre its respect. At the top of that list were Chaos Break and Hell Knight. I'd spent time with Chaos Break, capturing the atmosphere of its abandoned library and its Dino Crisis style combat. I was ready to talk about its creature design and how it fit into the late era horror boom. Then I hit a brick wall. I went to double check the US release date for the script and found nothing. It never happened. The game was a PAL and Japanese exclusive. The same thing happened with Hell Knight. It's a first-person survival horror game set in the Tokyo sewers, and it's incredibly tense. It's exactly the kind of hidden gem I love to highlight. But again, as I went to log the index entry, I realised it never touched American soil. These are ghost games. They look, sound and play like essential parts of the 32-bit horror canon, but for the 1278 mission, they don't technically exist. It's a strange feeling to have all this research and footage for a game you can't actually index. You've put in the work, you've felt the scares, and then the regional lockout kicks in 2 decades too late. It makes you wonder how many other horror fans in the US missed out on these atmospheric nightmares just because a publisher decided they wouldn't sell across the pond. For me, these are the ones that hurt the most to leave out. The games that actually clearly deserve a spot on the shelf, but were left in the regional shadows. This was the one that truly caught me off guard. Men in Black, the game. In the late 90s, Men in Black was an absolute juggernaut. It was everywhere. Toys, cartoons, the inescapable Will Smith theme song. Naturally, you'd assume a movie that big from a massive American studio would have a mandatory PlayStation release in the US. I'd actually planned a whole episode based around movie licensed games, and I had MIB right at the centre of the script. Then I did a check. To my genuine surprise, the game never had a North American release. It was a PAL and Japanese exclusive. How does one of the biggest American blockbusters of the decade skip its own home console? It makes no sense on paper, but it's a perfect example of the regional chaos of the era. Then you look at characters like Asterix and Tintin. These are European icons, so it's less of a shock that games like Asterix Mega Madness and Tintin Destination Adventure stayed local, but they represent a massive chunk of high quality platformers and adventures that the NTSC-U library just doesn't have. For those of us in the UK, Asterix was a staple. Seeing a PAL-only list like this makes you realise that Europe was often the final home for licensed titles that US publishers simply passed on. Every time I find a licensed game that looks half decent and fits in the Index vibe, I have to pause and check the regional code. More often than not, it's a SLES code, not a SLUS. It's a frustrating hurdle when you're trying to find a complete archive, and it turns the 1278 mission into a puzzle where the pieces from a completely different box keep falling out. It's a reminder that while we were often behind in tech, we were sometimes ahead in variety. If there's one thing that keeps the energy high in a collection, it's the arcade port. These are the games built for short, intense bursts of adrenaline, and for some reason, Europe became a secondary structure for Japanese arcade titles that the US completely ignored. Take a look at Rapid Reload. If you didn't know better, you'd think this was a flagship title from a legendary studio like Treasure. It's a gorgeous, fast-paced run and gun that feels like the spiritual sibling to Gunstar Heroes. It's colourful, it's loud, and it's exactly the kind of high-retention gameplay that defines the era. I'd almost put it in the Index just to have an excuse to talk about the sprite work, but once again, it's a PAL and Japanese exclusive, no US release. Then you'd have Crisis Beat. It's a 3D beat-em-up set on a hijacked cruise ship. It's simple, it's crunchy, and it feels like something you'd find in a seaside arcade in 1998. In the States, the 3D beat-em-up genre was struggling to find its footing, yet here was this polished, over-the-top brawler sitting on UK shelves the whole time. These games create a paradox in the Index. They represent the cool side of the PlayStation, the arcade perfect transition that Sony promised us, yet they are technically invisible in the North American library. When I see footage of Rapid Reload popping off the screen, it feels like a crime that it's not part of the 1278. It's these high energy ghosts that make you realise the US didn't just miss out on obscure RPGs, they missed out on some of the best pure action the console had to offer.
ようだ。もしこれ。みんな大変よ。なんかやばそう。タイムの始まり。
If there is one thing that defines the PlayStation's cool factor, it was Sony's willingness to get weird. In the late 90s, the brand was associated with club culture, abstract art, and games that didn't look like games. But as I've dug into the Index, I've realised that some of the most iconic avant-garde experiences on the system never actually made it to North America. The poster child for this is Vib-Ribbon. It's a game made entirely of vector lines where the levels are generated by the music CDs you put into the console. It's stylish, it's unique, and it's one of the most famous titles in the PlayStation's history. Yet for the US gamer in 1999, it didn't exist. It was a PAL and Japanese exclusive. I almost included it in the index in the bizarre bundle because it feels like such a pillar of the PS1 identity, but it's another ghost that haunts the 1278 count. Then you have Karushi, known in the US only as a limited demo called Intelligent Cube. In Europe, Karushi was a full retail release, minimalist puzzle game where you run around a void destroying giant rolling blocks. It has this incredible orchestral soundtrack that makes a simple puzzle game feel like a high-stakes psychological thriller. It is a must-play title that is synonymous with the PlayStation's grown-up image. Finding out these games were missing from the official US retail list feels like finding a hole in the history of the console. They weren't just niche titles, they were the games that proved the PlayStation was different from anything Nintendo and Sega were doing. For me, trying to build an index without Vib-Ribbon feels wrong. But that's the reality of the 1278 myth. Some of the most PlayStation games ever made are technically off limits.
Sorry. Uh-oh. Timeless adventures of me.
This is where the 1278 count starts to feel like a trap. When you move away from the big budget titles and start looking at the shovelware or the local heroes, the PAL list explodes in size. In the UK, we had an entire ecosystem of games that simply didn't exist anywhere else, and they occupy a massive amount of shelf space in any European collection. Take Hugo for example. If you grew up in Europe, you know Hugo the Troll. He was a television icon, and he had an entire library of PlayStation games. Hugo 2, Hugo Quest of the Sunstones, Hugo Frog Fighter. They are simple, colourful, and clearly aimed at younger audiences. In the US, Hugo barely made a dent, with only one or two late-era releases even touching the market, but in the PAL index, Hugo is a juggernaut. Then you have the local action heroes like Action Man. Where Action Man Operation Extreme actually made it to the US, we had the exclusive titles like Action Man Destruction X that remained locked to our shores. It's the same story for CT Special Forces. These are polished, entertaining games that felt like staples of our local game shop, but they are completely missing from the official US list. This is the rabbit hole that makes documenting the PS1 so difficult. You find a game that looks like a standard part of the library, and you realise it's actually a regional anomaly. It's not just one or two games, it's dozens of titles, from Hugo to Action Man to more Hen, that create a ghost library alongside the one I'm trying to finish. It makes the 1278 mission feel like I'm only seeing half of the picture, and it turns the simple act of counting games into a constant battle against regional obscurity. One of the most frustrating parts of building the index is coming across a game you know, you love, and you remember vividly, only to realise it technically doesn't exist in the North American library. This happens most often with what I call the ghost ports. These are the games that were massive on other platforms like the PC, but only ever found a home on the PlayStation 1 in Europe. A prime example of this is XCOM, Terror from the Deep. If you're a fan of strategy, XCOM is royalty. The first game, UFO Enemy Unknown, made it to the US PlayStation, but the sequel, the underwater, punishingly difficult follow-up, remains a PAL exclusive on the console. I'd spent time researching the turn-based mechanics and the brutal atmosphere, ready to log it in the index, only to find out that US players never got to experience the terror of Lobsterman on their CRT. Then you'd have something like Discworld Noir. It's a brilliant atmospheric adventure game set in Terry Pratchett's universe. It has an incredible hard-boiled detective vibe, a sharp script, and a style all its own. In the UK, it's a cult classic on the PS1, but in the States, it never happened. It's a ghost in the machine. You find these titles, you see the iconic black label PAL boxes, and you just assume that they were part of the global PlayStation family. Finding these games feels like finding a secret chapter of a book you've already read. They are high quality, fully realised ports that should be pillars of the PlayStation collection, but they don't count towards the 1278. It's a strange technicality that forces me to keep these gems in a separate folder, a shadow index of games that are too good to ignore, but too European to count. If the 1278 number is a lie, then why does everyone use it? This is where you step into the collector's battlefield. If you spend enough time on old forums or deep in the archives of PlayStation collecting, you'll realise that completing is less like a science and more like decades of long arguments. There is no master list from Sony that says these are the 1278 games, and that is final. Instead, it's a number carved out by people trying to make sense of the chaos. The problem is that the definition of a game starts to shift depending on who you ask. Do the Lightspan titles count? These were educational discs sold specifically to schools in the US, not in retail shops. Some collectors say they're essential, others say they're just interactive textbooks. What about not for resale demos that were bundled with consoles? Or the greatest hits versions that actually change the game's code to fix the bugs? Suddenly, your neat little list of 1278 starts to bloat or shrink like a sponge in water. Even AI can't help us here. I've tried feeding these lists into modern tools, asking them to verify the count, and they get just as confused as we do. They start mixing up European ports, Japanese re-releases, and budget titles that only existed for 6 months in a bargain bin. It's a mess of data that resists being indexed. You can search every corner of the internet for a 100% verified official list of 1278 NTSC-U games, and you will never find one that everyone agrees on. This is the reality of the PSX Index. I'm chasing a number that is essentially a piece of community folklore. It's a target we've effectively allocated because we need a finish line. When I finally reach that final game, I'm not just finishing a list, I'm finishing my version of a story that has 1,000 different endings depending on which collector you talk to. It turns the entire project into a living, breathing investigation rather than a simple checklist. If the number 1278 is a myth, then why am I still using it in every intro? Why am I letting a legend dictate the next few years of my life? It's because, in a library as massive and chaotic as the PlayStation's, you need a North Star. Without a target, the index is just a random collection of memories. Having that specific, disputed, slightly broken number gives the journey a shape. It turns a hobby into a mission. I've had to accept that this isn't a perfect sterile database. I'm a gamer, not a filing cabinet. When I realise I've accidentally indexed a PAL-only game like Adidas Power Soccer, or nearly spent a week on Chaos Break before finding out it was a regional exclusive, it doesn't ruin the project. It just adds to the story. It shows the fingerprints of someone who actually grew up with these discs. Someone whose brain is still wired to the PAL shelves of the 90s, even while trying to document the US library. The 1278 lie is actually the most honest part of the show. It's a confession that we're all just trying to make sense of an era that was never meant to be organised. Sony wasn't thinking about completionist YouTubers in 2026 when they were shipping discs to different corners of the globe. They were just trying to win the console war. The fact that the count is a mess is just a reflection of how wild and successful the PlayStation actually was. It was too big to be contained by a simple spreadsheet. So, I'm keeping the number, I'm keeping the hook, I'm keeping the 1278 target because it represents the full set dream, even if the reality has a few glitches. When I finally hit that finish line, it won't be about whether I found every single educational disc or avoided every PAL ghost. It will be about the fact that we sat down and gave this entire era the respect it deserved. One game at a time, mistakes and all. So where does that leave the index? If the finish line is a moving target and the library is haunted by PAL ghosts, what are we actually doing here? The truth is, the 1278 lie is the best kind of mystery. It's a reminder, no matter how much we think we know about the PlayStation, there's always another regional exclusive, another cancelled port, or another international edition waiting to be discovered. The mission doesn't change just because the math is a bit fuzzy. Whether the real count is 1278, 1300, or somewhere in between, the goal remains the same: to sit down with these games, hear the startup chime, and document what made the era special. Every time I accidentally research a game like Chaos Break or Men in Black, I'm not wasting my time, I'm just expanding the archive. I'm learning about the games that defined our childhoods in the UK, even if they don't technically fit into the North American box I've built for the show. As I move forward, I'm going to keep the 1278 counter ticking. I'm going to keep using it as my guide, but I'm doing it with a wink now. We all know the secret. We know that the PlayStation was too big, too chaotic, and too successful to ever truly be finished. There will always be someone in the comments to remind me of a game I missed or a regional I technically overlooked. And honestly, that's exactly how it should be. It's a conversation, not a lecture. The PSX Index is a journey through a library that refuses to be tamed. It's a collection of memories, mistakes, and ghost games that shouldn't be there, but are anyway. We're going to keep climbing this mountain, one disc at a time, until we hit that legendary number. And if we find out that the mountain is a little taller than we thought when we get to the top, well, we'll just have to keep climbing.
Here we have a normal, healthy young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes.
Proof that we saps must be on our guard.
Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.